In this section, we are going to learn about gross domestic product. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is the value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given year. There are three key parts of this definition. First, GDP measures value, not quantity. Second, it includes only final goods and services, not intermediate goods. Third, it counts production within a country. GDP is used as a broad measure of the size of a nation's economy. GDP can be measured in two different but equivalent ways. On the demand side, we measure GDP by adding up how much people spend on goods and services. On the supply side, we measure GDP by adding up the value of everything that is produced. Because every transaction has both a buyer and a seller, you know, these two approaches always give the same GDP value. To understand the demand side of the GDP, we should ask a simple question. Who buys all the goods and services produced? The answer can be divided into four main components: consumer spending, business investment, government spending, and net exports. Consumption includes spending by household on goods and services. Investment refers to spending by businesses on plant, equipment, and inventories, not financial investment like stocks. Government spending is federal, state, and local government spending on goods and services. The last component is net export, which equals export minus import. When we combine the four components of demand, we get the GDP equations. GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net export. This formula will appear often in macroeconomics, so it's important to become comfortable with it. The pie chart shows how much each component contributed to US GDP in 2022. The largest slice by far is consumption, making up about the 67% of total GDP. Investment and government spending each make up around 17 to 18%, while net exports are a very small share, just over 3%, and often negative for the US. This breakdown helps us understand which sectors drive economic activity. In the US, consumer spending is the biggest engine of the economy, which is why changes in consumer confidence have a large impact on GDP. Let's look at how each component of GDP contributes to the US economy over time. On the left graph, you can see the long-run shares of consumption, investment, and government spending as the percentage of GDP from 1960 to 2015. The key fact is that consumption consistently makes up the largest portion of GDP, usually between 60% and 70%. Investment and government spending are much smaller. On the right graph, we focus on imports and exports. The green section highlights the period when the US had a trade surplus, meaning exports were greater than imports. This happened mainly in the 1960s and early 1970s. And after that point, the US consistently runs a trade deficit, means uh, imports exceed exports. You can see that the import line stays above the export lines throughout most of the period. This trade deficit reduced the value of net export. Remember, net exports can be positive or negative, and in the US, it is typically negative. So overall, these graphs shows how the structure of US economy has stayed fairly consistent. Consumer spending is the largest component, while trade patterns have shifted from surplus to persistent deficit. We can also measure GDP by looking at what is produced in the economy. Production is divided into five categories: durable goods, non-durable goods, services, structures, and changes in inventories. Even though this approach looks different from the demand side method, it results in the same GDP value. Durable goods are long-lasting items like cars and appliances. Non-durable goods are short-lived items like food and clothing. Services include activities such as healthcare, education, and entertainment. Structures include buildings like houses, offices, and factories. Inventories include goods that have been produced but not yet sold. So let's look at the graphs to see how each item contributes to US economy over time. The pie chart breaks total production into five categories. First, services make up the highest share, about 60% of GDP. Durable goods are about 16 to 17%, and non-durable goods make up about 13%, and structures represent about the 9%, and changes in inventories are very small, close to zero in most years. The key point is that the US is a service-based economy. Most economic activities today comes from providing services rather than manufacturing goods. On the right side, the line graph shows how these categories have changed over time. The share of services has risen steadily from about 40% in the 1950s to over 60% today. Meanwhile, both durable and non-durable goods have gradually declined. Structures fluctuate but remain a smaller component overall. These long-term trends reflect big shifts in the US economy, moving away from manufacturing and toward service industry. So, what does it tell us? GDP is widely used to measure living standards, track economic growth, and identify recessions and expansions. It also allows us to compare the size of economies over time or across countries. However, it does not capture everything about people's well-being. Economies do not grow smoothly over time. Instead, they experience ups and downs, which is called business cycle. These ups and downs create two main phases. An economic expansion is a period of a rising output and employment. A recession is a period of declining economic activities. The turning points between two phases are called the peak and trough. The peak is the highest point of the business cycle. It marks the moment just before the economy begins to contract. The trough is the lowest point of the cycle. It marks the end of the recession when economic activity has bottomed out. After the trough, the economy begins to recover and enter expansion again. In the United States, the National Bureau of Economic Research officially determines when recessions and expansions start and end. They don't rely only on GDP. They also consider the employment, personal income, industrial production, and consumer spending. So The bidding cycle captures the short-run fluctuation in economic activity. One important issue in calculating GDP is double counting. If we counted intermediate goods, we could overstate GDP. To avoid this, GDP includes only the value of the final good, or we use the value-added method, which measures how much value each step adds. The table below shows an example using a cell phone. If we add up the value added at each stage, we get $199. This is the true contribution to GDP. Notice that the prices column shows the larger values at each stage. And if we added all of those, we would get $328, which overestimates the production because the same value gets counted several times. Remember, GDP measures the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given year. Because of this definition, some items are counted and others are not. We know the four components that are included in GDP. CIG, net export, right? However, we have some items that are not included in GDP. For intermediate goods, counting them would cause double counting. Transfer payments like welfare or unemployment benefits do not reflect new production. Non-market activities like cooking at home or mowing your own lawn don't enter GDP because they have no market price. Also, when you buy a used car or used furniture, it is not counted in current GDP because it was already counted when it was first produced. For illegal goods and black market activity, these transactions are not officially recorded and therefore not included in GDP. We often compare GDP with standard of living. GDP focuses only on market production, so it's not capture many important parts of our life. That means a country can have a higher GDP but still not have a higher standard of living. Here are some key things GDP does not include. First is leisure time. GDP does not tell us whether people work 30 hours a week or 60 hours a week. More work may increase GDP, but it can reduce quality of life. Second is environmental quality, health, and education. GDP rises when we spend more on healthcare, but it does not measure whether people are healthy. It also does not reflect clean air, safe water, or access to quality schooling. Third is non-market production. Activities like cooking at home, taking care of family, or volunteering contribute to our well-being, but they are not bought or sold in the market, so they don't show up in GDP. Fourth is income inequality. GDP can rise even if most of the gains go to a small group of people. GDP tells us the size of the economic pie, but not how it is shared. Fifth is availability of technology and products. Innovations like smartphones, internet access, or medical advancements can greatly improve our life, but GDP does not directly measures the value of these improvements. So GDP is useful for tracking economic growth, but it does not fully capture people's actual well-being. Thank you for watching.